Humans are weird. It seemed like a good idea at the time. Fifth sister rotated her triangular head for what seemed like the 100th time to focus an eye on the report in front of her. She flexed her antenna and wished for what seemed like the 1,000th time that there was a sister with greater seniority anywhere in the sector to whom she could pass this responsibility. Not even the delicately applied murals that mimicked First Father's garden could calm her at this point. This required wind. She shook out her frill vigorously and noted in the tracking system that she would be out of her office for a few hours. She passed a few humans in the hall on the way out and ruefully noticed how calm, how normal they were. Their pheromone balance suggested nothing but the general stress of a workday. Their membrane colors were glowing with even light and colors. To look at them, you would never suspect anything untoward had happened. Least of all, that the pseudo-brother of their hive had nearly died a violent death at the appendages of his best friend. That thought triggered a mental note, and she deviated in her path to check into the medical tanks. She fought back a wince at the chaos in the medical ward. The human stasis tanks were almost never activated. Why would they be? The kind of injury that a human couldn't just shake off almost never occurred in the growing times. It wasn't until the dangerous great harvest time came that such injures would be likely. Even then, they had never been needed. The one that was now humming softly with the effort of keeping its occupant alive had to be forcibly yanked from under the piles of other supplies that had been stacked on top of it over the long, blessedly uneventful years of its residence. The thought that one of her charges might die because she had failed to maintain basic tidiness was a horrific thought that had nearly had her calling her father for help, despite the fact that he was entire systems away. Fifth sister knew that she should have had it cleared out the day she took up residence at the chief medic. But there had been so many other pressing priorities. She licked her eyes, feeling the stress building in the folds of her lung. There were so many things she had done wrong, but once a vine broke, there was no patching it. She walked up to the second, much smaller tank placed over the readout of the human tank and shifted the smaller one to get a better look at the information. Shifts quickly thrust a gripping appendage out of the mass of the 4 ungulates who had crowded the medical tank to comfort him and gestured for her attention. There was a brief writing of the mass of appendages as he tried to gesture the question to her. Then he gave up and a vague voice drifted out of the tank. "Is he doing well?" "He is stable and in no immediate danger," Fifth Sister assured the underrate. "Once the supply ship gets in with the rest of the blood and we are able to do a full transfusion, there is every reason to suspect we can pull him out of the coma." The ungulates gave a relieved murmur, though this was nothing she hadn't told them a dozen times already. The check complete, she continued to the airlock. She pulled her solar shield off of the wall and fitted it around her neck and over her frill. The dome over her antenna was annoying, but having to regrow them after they withered under the intense ultraviolet spectrum of this local star's would have been far more annoying. And besides, regenerated antennae were never quite as aesthetically pleasing as your originals. She slipped out the airlock and into the brisk air. 2 of the 5 suns were shining down on the courtyard of the base, and she took a moment to absorb the sense of the place. Still alien after so much time, yet still soothing with the hints of life and movement. The shade of the forest whispered to her too strongly for her to ignore it long, however, and she stepped out lightly onto the main walking path. At the edge of the station clearing, she gave a polite nod to the small mound of detritus that she assumed marked the position of Ranger capturing the spreading solar rays' primary node of awareness. She really sure that it did. Ranger capturing the spreading solar rays was somewhat notoriously subsocial, preferring to distribute himself through the duff of his assigned forest and passively monitor his college's behavior rather than interacting with them. He would frequently abandon the indicator of an awareness node and completely forget to distribute the component detritus to let the others know his awareness wasn't there anymore. She passed the ring of security fences that were almost never activated and set out at the hopping pace that was so useful for covering long distances with the minimal effort. On the smooth main path, it was safe enough to let her mind wander, and wander it did right back to the question that had driven her out of doors. She didn't wonder what Shifts quickly had been thinking. The enthusiastic young biochemist had neither the genetic predisposition, nor the training, nor even the life experience to understand the import of what he had been doing that night. The concept of catching a falling seed pod was beyond the grasp of an ungulate. Calculating all potential vectors of an irregularly shaped object rotating on at least 2 axes as it spun through the atmosphere was so far out of an ungulate's response profile that he could not be held responsible. The dozen humans that surrounded him, persistence predators and tree-foraging scavengers whose ancestors' existence had depended in large part on being able to calculate the vectors of sentient animals, well, they should have known better. She compressed her lung to let out a tired sigh and walked on. There could not have been any malice in the humans. Every scrap of evidence was against it. Setting aside what she knew personally about the humans who staffed this station, how they were even more prone to interspecies bonding than usual, every political and pragmatic factor drove the humans to keep their ungulate friends safe and healthy. Add to that the instinctive cuddle reaction that the ungulate's size and relative physical helplessness induced in the humans, and the concept of any of them deliberately traumatizing, SciFi was absurd. There was always, of course, the concept that one of the other humans had had aggressive intentions towards the one currently lying in the medical pod. However, she had been observing this cadre's mental health and general social cohesion for years now. They were a well-integrated group of humans, if ever there was one. That aside, even a human's impressive spatial reasoning couldn't have predicted how the situation would have progressed once SciFi had released the axe. No, deliberate malfeasance was out of the question. That still left negligence, a serious enough issue, compounded by the fact that the majority of the humans had admitted to have been consuming some drink they had been distilling called moonshine. She wasn't quite sure what that was, but they had freely suggested that it had been the primary cause in their impaired judgment. That still left the question of what had impaired the judgment of the humans who hadn't consumed the prettily named fluid. Fifth Sister realized that she had arrived at the scene of the incident, a clearing below the canopy used to mount soil monitors and other testing equipment. She tilted her head to observe the canopy above, and satisfied that it was fully as dense as it needed to be, she removed her radiation shield with a relieved sigh. On one side of the clearing, various storage containers were lined out, marked as human manufacture by their simple and somewhat brutal utilitarian design. Someone had tried to relieve the dull exteriors by drawing various plants on them in a sickly green paint. The primitive effort with low-quality materials shouldn't have been aesthetically pleasing, but there was something soothing in the blatant attempt to improve life that warmed your frill. Fifth Sister eased onto a fallen log used for a perch and sat back to muse. It was a crazy night, the trees whispered to her as she sat there. Fifth Sister felt her frills snap out and flush emerald with fear. Her antennas curled, and she just barely managed to resist the urge to snatch her utility knife out of its fold in her kilt. "Ranger capturing the spreading solar rays," she managed to say in a mostly calm voice. The Shatar had understood the concept of how fungal-type species interacted with an entire forest, having no one central mass, communicating with every living thing for untold generations before they had become one of the first species to achieve spaceflight. That didn't make it any less spooky somehow when one of them decides to comment on current events out of nowhere. "Shall we get started?" the branches whispered, sending a chill down her antenna. This was exactly why she left interactions with the gathering to her human co-workers. "Get started with what?" she asked. "My interview about the incident that nearly killed that nice young human, of course," the bark hissed at her, somehow managing to produce a surprised tone. "I was not aware that you had witnessed the incident," Fifth Sister admitted, "though your insight would be valuable." "I witness all that passes in the forest," the voice went on. "That is my purpose. Also, the human forest rituals are fascinating, and the waste that drops from their moonshine distillery allows me to feed the seedlings in ways I never could without them." "Then, please tell me what you can," Fifth Sister said as she pulled out her datapad. She was torn between relief at this perfectly legitimate excuse to avoid being alone with her own thoughts, and unease at the thought that Ranger capturing the spreading solar rays essentially had a record of everything that she had done in the forest. Unlike many gathering, he was able to speak concisely and got to the point quickly. He described how the humans and ungulates had arrived tired and fatigued after a long week of the grueling physical labor the forest demanded, how they had opened the containers that contained the moonshine and had distributed the foodstuffs they had brought. They had sung songs and danced across the open clearing. They had begun to play their games, first bringing out the numbered cards that they used to test their math skills, then stringing out their tape measures and seeing who could balance their lengths out the longest. Finally, they had brought out the hatchets that were so necessary to their work, and had begun misusing them in their favorite manner. "That tree right there," the voice said as the tree in question shivered. Fifth Sister tilted her head and walked over to the round from a long, dead stump that had been mounted to the trunk at the height of her head. It bore many, many scars where the blade of some hatches had bitten into it. "What possible purpose could there be to throwing hatchets?" she asked of Nowhere in Particular. "One human told me it was some sort of ancient combat practice," Nowhere in Particular answered. As I was saying, the hatchet throwing had begun and Shifts quickly expressed interest. He postulated that while he could not generate a throwing motion of any force, he could easily best any human for generating a rotational motion. "Did none of the humans object?" Fifth Sister asked. They would all have been in danger from the complete lack of directionality. "No," the trees whispered. "At that time, they all seemed to think it a perfectly good idea." The whispering died down, and Fifth Sister gave one final sigh. "Humans are weird catch and release." Second Grandmother slowly tilted her head so that her half-blind eye seemed to stare down at the reptilian first mechanic in front of her workbench. She well knew how effective an intimidation tactic a partially necrotic organ was. She had kept 3 generations of daughters in line with it. Granted, it didn't work on ungulates or the gathering, but every species that had eyes respected her half-dead one. First Mechanic stared up at her with a defiant squint, hiding his amber eyes from her gaze for several moments before relaxing in submission and letting his scaled membranes open to reveal his pupils, wide in the dim light of her workshop. Satisfied that he was properly cowed, she drew in a broad breath. "Why?" she asked, remembering to deepen her tones to express sternness to the reptilian more used to communication with vocal cords. "Do you want access to the humans' personal interest files?" "It doesn't need to be all of the humans," First Mechanic said, his tail twitching in a display of nervousness that highlighted his tongue flicking out to clean his lips. "Just the one I indicated." "Humans," Second Grandmother interrupted him, quite enjoying the transgression sensation the act of impoliteness gave her, "are very chary of sharing non-essential information." "I am aware," First Mechanic grumbled as his feet kneaded the ground under him. "They insisted on strict rules on the sharing of information as their right of acceptance into the larger community," she went on. "I will need a formal justification before I even consider giving you access to that information." First Mechanic hissed and sputtered in frustration, and then swung his tail in a wide gesture that she believed indicated a direction he wished to draw her attention to. However, she was unable to perceive the intended direction. "That!" he burst out. A long moment stretched between them in the dusky silence. First Mechanic was now still and focused on her, his amber eyes blinking steadily in the dry air. "I will need more specific data," she finally prompted him. "Can't you see them out there?" First Mechanic demanded. "I cannot see anything outside of my workshop," she reminded him, reaching up with her tongue to indicate her mostly dead eye. First Mechanic hissed in a disturbed tone and bobbed his head in apology. "The humans," he began, "are out perusing insects." He waved his tail in the same gesture to indicate their location. "You might be aware that the local granivorous species are experiencing a massed production season," he said. Second Grandmother let her triangular head rotate in agreement. "I fabricated some protective coverings for Second Grandfather's plants," she told him. "He was quite distressed when they devoured an entire season's worth of growth and development. Well, the insects have entered a phase where their primary mode of travel is a very quick jumping motion," First Mechanic said. His body gave an odd spasm that Second Grandmother suspected to be an attempt to imitate the motion of the jumping insect. "The humans?" First Mechanic licked his lips in confusion. "This morning I came outside to bask and found Ranger Benji crouched on my favorite basking rock." "Did you ask him to move?" Second Grandmother asked him in the gentle tone Second Grandfather had taught her to use to diffuse resource conflict in their little ones. "Of course," First Mechanic, "or rather I tried, but before I could even ask Ranger, Benji sprang off of the rock and caught at something with his hands. It was one of the insects. It got away, but Ranger Benji followed it. I was still muzzy from sleep cold." "Aren't the sleeping accommodations heated?" Second Grandmother asked sharply. "I personally installed the circulation systems." "Well, yes," First Mechanic admitted, But the circulation system has been glitching. I wanted to troubleshoot it myself before I brought it up to you. You should have brought it up to me immediately, she said with an irritated click. Please note that I was muzzy from sleep cold, he pointed out. Anyway, I climbed up on the rock and watched the humans as I warmed. They were all running around the meadow catching the insects. What did they do with them? Second grandmother asked. They would just let them go, First mechanic explained, reaching up a fist of claws to rub at his eyes. Second grandmother had to fight back a wince and remind herself that the reptilians had literal armor on their outer membranes and hardly needed to avoid scratching. If they caught a particular larger or aesthetically pleasing one, they would show it to the others and admire it together, but for the most part they simply let them go, First mechanic said with a huff. Ranger Benji seemed to be the instigator of the behavior, First mechanic went on after a long pause. I began to suspect that he had arranged this to facilitate some research project, but I was unable to ask him before the morning shift began and the humans dispersed. Due to the sleep muzzy, I wasn't able to identify any specific humans other than Ranger Benji. So all I want? First mechanic took a half-beat of conversation to open his eyes wider and angle his head to maximize his neonatal appearance. All I want is to know if Ranger Benji has a background in entomology, First mechanic said. Second grandmother couldn't quite help the amused angle of her mandibles, even if she was far too old for her neck frill to betray her amusement at the simple begging. I will see what I can get for you, she finally agreed. This is rather curious behavior and bears further inspection. Humans are weird, check again. Oh no, I am quite the drifting strand in my home reef, Deeply Considers said with a cheerful wriggle of his lagging end. Data analysis is not a very sought-after position by most ungulates. But data analysis is a necessity, Fourth Brother said in surprise as he gently massaged the core of the stressed ungulate. Second Father says that once a culture progresses far enough, that instinct becomes insufficient, that everyone we know of has developed formal data analysis in some form or another. Even the gathering, and you know that they almost can do it on instinct, have to preserve data in fibrous networks. Quite, Deeply Considers agreed, emitting a happy vibrating sound he claimed to have learned from a predator species the humans were particularly fond of. We all had to learn to do it, but very, very few ungulates ever learned to like it. In fact, Deeply Considers paused in his conversation to flip over and expose his other half to the masseuse's ministrations. I do believe that, as of the last comparative population productive effort census, we rated as having the lowest rates of native data analysts in the populated galaxy, he said with a happy hum. The shallow pool he was in was filled with a liquid that wasn't water on some technical medical level, but it was the perfect temperature to soothe out stressed appendages, and Fourth Brother was a wonder with his fingers. He couldn't match the controlled power of a human, of course, but even the most stressed ungulate rarely really needed all that power. Well, Fourth Brother said with a wry click of his mandibles, if this is the result of pursuit of a career in data analysis, it is probably wise of your species to avoid it in general. He have a tweak of a particularly stressed portion of Deeply Considers' core, and the ungulate flexed his appendages in a gesture that loosely translated that he couldn't argue the point. Now, Fourth Brother said, flaring his pseudo-frill a stern yellow, as this is the 5th appointment you have needed to schedule this cycle, I will need to inspect your working area for the situation that is causing this problem. Come now. Oh, Deeply Considers said in a cheerful tone as he slipped down thorough the floor exit. There is no need for an inspection. I know exactly the problem. Then why do you not resolve it? Fourth Brother asked. The requests are in the order key, of course. Deeply Considers gestured up at him from the stream under the solid floor as they moved down the hallway. The problem is the dryland computer controls are only rated water-resistant. I can drip all over them all I want, but I can't actually submerge them for any length of time. These handy undercurrents aside, this base wasn't really built with ungulates in mind. Fourth Bother rubbed his mandibles together thoughtfully. It made sense. In this sector of space, the ungulates were newcomers, having arrived several generations after the humans and Shatar had begun joint efforts. If the necessary equipment were already on the way, there was nothing Fourth Brother could really do, but it wouldn't hurt to inspect the workspace anyway. They reached the data analysis shared workspace eventually, and Fourth Brother was mildly surprised to see 2 humans in the area this late in the day. From the way their impossibly broad shoulders hunched over their workstations, he speculated that they could both use his services. However, he was here for another purpose. Deeply Considers indicated his workspace and began to explain how he kept his resting pool just under the data entry surface to avoid accidents. "Sean!" one human suddenly called out, frustration drawing the rounded, vocalized portion of the name out unnaturally. "You need to resend the document!" "I already sent it," the other human, presumable Sean, replied in an aggravated tone. "Search your bloody spam clusters!" "I did," the first human insisted, his own voice shifting from tones of frustration to tones of aggression. "It isn't there. You must have forgotten to send it." "It's right here in my sent cluster," Sean retorted. "I'm looking at it." "Check! Fine!" the first human snapped out. "I'll do it." Again. Fourth brother instinctively put a hand down to soothe Deeply Considers. Human confrontation was somewhat legendary. He didn't think that this one was going to get physical, but as the larger sapient he had a duty to grab Deeply Considers and run, as the nearest portal to the undercurrent was some distance away. However, the seconds stretched out and the first human didn't speak up again. Deeply Considers was clearly forming a question gesture when Sean called out. "Found it, didn't you?" he asked. The first human, his voice distinctly less aggressive, made an indistinguishable grunt in reply. "What was that?" Sean asked. His tone was different as well. Fourth brother thought he recognized that first sister had told him was a mocking tone. "It was right where you said it would be," the first human snapped. There was another long pause, then the first human spoke again in a tight tone. "Thank you." Sean gave a small chuckle and responded with a word fourth brother didn't know, but his tone was relaxed and the pheromone profile in the room noticeably softened. Whatever that last word was, it had soothed the first human's offense. After another long moment, the first human emitted a wry chuckle. Deeply Considers gestured that they should probably remove themselves, and fourth cousin coiled an antenna in agreement. Once out in the main passageway, he tilted his head down to look at the undulate below him, and he flexed his fingers, remembering the stress damage built up in the undulate's fibers. "Do you think," fourth brother suggested cautiously, "that perhaps your stress is not entirely due to the limitations of your workstation?" "Well, yes," the undulate agreed with a depreciating gesture that involved a good third of his appendages. "But what can you do about humans?" "My first cousin is the company mediator," fourth brother said with a ripple of his pseudo-frill. "We'll see what she has to suggest."